Welcome to the last Collaborative Democracy Network event of the year. Hopefully this is your last serious work event and then you can all just break for Christmas festivities after this. But we should tonight have a really good and interesting discussion. We've got an amazing panel to speak to you and join in conversation with you this evening. For those of you who don't know Demos, we are a cross-party think tank. We've been around for about 30 years and we're really on a mission to try and tackle the democratic emergency that has seen in recent years trust in democracy and trust in politics decline off the edge of a cliff, with too many people across the country feeling a pervading sense of powerlessness, pointlessness, and precarity. So this issue, where citizens feel like they have no power and no voice to make changes on things that they really care about, and feeling like they can't really hold government to account, it's particularly in this current climate, this is the issues that we want to explore on the panel tonight. We do know, as everybody does, there's tools. Some people, if they've got something to say, they've got something to fight about, there's tools that they can use. They petition, there are local campaigns, they can set up national campaigns, they can protest on the street. But many people ask, what's the point? What is the difference that any of these actions can take? More often, people are saying that there's no point in putting the time or energy into that sort of campaign or protest because who's listening anyway? But we would argue in a healthy democracy, it's fundamentally important that people can have their voices heard, that they feel like they can make a difference to things that matter to them, that they can challenge government of all tiers on decisions that are made and hold them accountable for the impacts that those decisions have. But one of the questions we want to look at tonight is well, what happens if the government isn't listening? Or maybe just as bad, if it's perceived to not be listening. How then can citizens feel like their voices matter and that government is accountable to them as citizens? And how do we balance the right for people to be heard with a preference for others to live a quiet life without the disruption of protest? So there's a lot of questions. There's quite a lot there that we want to get into this evening. And I'm very, very glad that we are joined by a fantastic panel, which contains a multitude of different political perspectives and experiences, which is really good. I hope that's going to make for a very, very interesting conversation. We are joined by Max Wilkinson, MP for Cheltenham and the Liberal Democrats Home Affairs spokesperson, joined by Sir Robert Buckland, former MP, Secretary of State for Justice and visiting professor in law at LSE. We've got Annabel Dunham, columnist and senior political commentator at the Daily Telegraph. Sorry, my notes are out of order. Ross Wyn-Jones, Real Britain columnist at the Mirror, and Susan Pinckney, head of research and insights at Carnegie UK. What we're going to do is start with short opening speeches from all the panelists. Then I've got a few questions, and then we're going to open up as soon as we can to questions from the floor. So please, as everyone's speaking, get your questions ready. What do you want to, get them to dig a bit deeper on? What questions does it leave you with? Hopefully we'll have a really interesting conversation going between the panel and the floor. We will wrap up this part of the proceedings by about 7:15, and then we've got drinks and nibbles and more networking till about 8 o'clock. So please do stay around and meet the other very, very interesting people that we have in the audience tonight. But first, I'm going to hand over to Susan from Carnegie. So Carnegie has just published the Life in the UK 2025 data, which is on your seat. You should have that booklet with you. It makes really sober reading about democratic well-being and people's perceptions of government accountability. So Susan, it'd be really great if you could tell us just a little bit more about what you found.
Sure. Everyone's got copies on their chair, so I better make sure that what I say is correct, because you can also check in real time. So I work for an organisation called Carnegie UK. For those of you who don't know us, we're based up in sunny Dunfermline in Scotland. I was set up by the philanthropist Andrew Carnegie over 100 years ago, and our remit is to look at wellbeing across the UK and Ireland. So about 3 years ago, we decided to start measuring collective wellbeing across the UK, which has led us to the Life in the UK programme. We're committed to producing that until at least 2030. It's a survey of around 7,000 people conducted each May. I think that's crucial to remember in the conversations about to ensue. So the latest research was conducted in May of this year, and as Miriam said, we published the reports just in the last few weeks. So we look at four aspects of well-being, policy domains, so social, economic, environmental, and democratic. It will come as no surprise that I'm going to focus on democratic this evening, but if you're interested in the others, either ask me questions later or they're in the report. So democratic well-being, the score that we get to, and this is the one number that if you remember anything else numerically tonight, is 41 out of 100 in the UK. So that's a derived score from lots of questions that go into that, but effectively 41 out of 100, 41 out of 100 is the score for democratic well-being, which doesn't need to be a statistician or a mathematician or anything else to know that that's not very high at all. It has gone up a little bit since last year, from a level of 40. So again, not particularly good. But across the 4 domains that we look at, is by far the lowest. The next lowest is into the 60s. So in the conversations that we have around the report and everything else, that tends to be the one that people focus on. And it's really about us all having a voice in what matters to us. So the questions that go in there are things like, can you influence decisions affecting the UK? We saw that 72% do not feel that they can affect decisions. That's actually changed from previous years, but you're clearly almost 3/4 isn't great. We do see that 54% have medium or high trust in the UK government, but then the converse of that is around 46% do not have trust in the UK government. But I'm not part of political in this. I'm very independent. What I would say is that has gone up 9 percentage points since last year. Again, the May timing of the research is crucial. It was on the back of the local elections where we saw quite big changes in England in terms of some of the councils. And also it was the first time since we did the research since the Labour government came in. So that was 9 percentage points higher than the 2024, but clearly still some way to go. We also see that 54% have medium or high trust in MPs, which again has gone up slightly, so a slight increase in MPs in UK and government overall. But we're seeing a decrease in local council trust, so 68% medium or high trust in local councils. That's down 4 percentage points since the previous years. But also in things like social media, big tech companies, they're also going down quite considerably. So 42% have low trust in big tech. And despite the numbers that use social media, 60% say that they have low trust into social media at all. So it's not just about politics, it's not just politicians and institutions, or on the national level. It's local, it's national, and it's across the board in other institutions as well. For those working in news media, you have a medium or high, your medium high trust has actually gone up a little bit from 62 to 64%, so one of the better ones. But again, there's about a third of people who are saying that they don't trust the news media. And I think the only other thing to really say at this point is that in most of this report, we see quite large differences demographically in the different domains. There's some demographics that really stand out at having good or bad social well-being, for example. In democratic well-being, it's pretty much poor across everyone. So we don't see the same levels of standing out. We do see that disabled people and people in social housing have the lowest at 37. And the highest, although it only gets as high as 46, compared to the average of 41, is amongst those earning over £100,000 and those in the areas of lower deprivation. But as I say, it's the one area in this report where we don't see big differences across multiple different demographics because it's amongst everyone. So that's all I'm going to say, really. As I say, I can answer questions as we go or at the end, or obviously take copies of the report with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susan. Max, can I come to you? So could you reflect a little on how that plays out in your constituency, and also how you think that power can be brought closer to the people?
Of course. So when I was looking at the title, it was alluding to how can citizens make their voices heard in a healthy democracy. And I think we need to reflect that at the moment we don't have a particularly healthy democracy in this country. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's really important we have this kind of discussion. And the health of democracy as a liberal is something I hold very dear. And I know Robert, as a Conservative, will think the same with people as, you know, whether on the left, right or centre of politics, if they're involved in politics and public life, we have that in common. And that's a really important thing. But at the moment, where I see there being a real problem is that we have very centralised power in this country, and we have a really underfunded local democracy. And it's really interesting that one of the first contributions there was all about how local councils are less trusted, and traditionally they have been much more trusted. And as a local councillor for 10 years, I was told that, you know, local government's very trusted and central government is very mistrusted by people. And that is a real problem, because if power is further away from people, I think they'll be more sceptical about it. I'm a former journalist, so I value the process of journalism. I think that's really important in our public debate. There is some absolutely brilliant journalism that goes on in this country. There is also quite a lot of journalism that's dressed up, well, opinion that's dressed up as journalism, and tittle-tattle commentary that's dressed up as journalism too. And that's sometimes, I think, that blurred line between what is news and what is fact and then what is opinion is a real difficulty for a lot of people to be able to, I guess, untie when they're working out what is fact and what isn't. And particularly now we have a really diffuse media. In the past, we'd have known that we were a Telegraph reader or a Mirror reader or a Guardian reader and what we were going to get from that. Now we have a much more diffuse media ecosystem, which makes it very difficult for people to work out what is fact and what is fiction. And I hear that on the doorstep reflected back to me from voters. We obviously have social media, which is a massive problem at the moment for engagement. I'm tempted to say, you know, how you make your voice heard as a citizen in 2025 in the UK. Set up an X account and start writing some sort of nativist content, and it will go around the world really, really quickly. Your voice will be heard as quickly as you want it to be, not in a way that I would be comfortable with, and I would suggest probably not in a way that most people on the panel this evening would be comfortable with either. But that is a really easy way to get your voice heard. Get some content about, you know, how you think immigration's too high, or immigration is the big thing that's tearing the country apart, etc. And that goes around the world because social media, run by the world's richest man, X, is now making sure that you can have your voice heard in a really easy way that you couldn't in the past. And of course, as a Liberal Democrat, I'm contractually obliged to tell you that one of the things that stops people's voices being heard is that we have a rubbish voting system in this country. So at the last election, Labour got 33% of the vote and 2/3 of the seats. That's not democratic. And the last time a party got more than 50% of the vote and more than 50% of the seats in the House of Commons was a really, really long time ago. And that does lead to a lot of people feeling like their voice isn't heard. And the same applies at local council level too. So what this leads to, I believe, the lack of power devolved to local people, the lack of the lack of a proper discussion in the media that people are easily able to navigate, the rubbish voting system and social media where people think their voices can be heard is basically systemic inertia, an actual inability of people to have their voices heard and to have their opinions reflected in the public debate. But I think there are some glimmers of hope actually, and the government's devolution agenda, which they put forward, is not what I would call proper devolution. Right, my council is being abolished. My council and my constituency are basically the same place, and the local council in Cheltenham is being abolished. So we will lose, as part of this devolution agenda, the other local voice that speaks for Cheltenham that is not the local MP, and that is a problem. But the shifting of powers from Westminster to regional mayors, I think, is something that could be pretty transformative. It must come with money, and it must be done in a way that enables local people to hold to account those new mayors. Local government reorganisation could be a thing that could be useful if it's done in the right way. You've got to get more power closer to communities, and I think there is a role for setting up new parishes and devolving more to grassroots and parish levels to make sure that, you know, you can hold to account that people are running the local park and the local play area. And as a parent, that's something I think is really important to my quality of life, and I know it is to most people of my age and my constituency as well. And the other glimmer of hope is that the two-party system is now thoroughly broken down. Look at the opinion polls. We've basically got Reform ahead, but they're only on 28 or 29%. That's a bad thing, in my opinion. We don't want Reform in government. But the fact that there is now a split into 5 ways and we've got a proper multi-party system over time will mean that we have to have democratic reform in a way that reforms the system. And after that, I suggest that probably we will get some of the proper reforms to the democratic system in this country that we need. And as a Liberal Democrat, I don't need to tell you what I think on all of those, because you will be well aware of what I think.
Thank you, Matt. Annabelle, come to this. Sorry.
No, that's quite right.
From your perspective, can you say how you think scrutiny, plurality, and open disagreement can be maintained in a Liberal democracy?
Yes, sure. And thank you so much for having me this evening. Well, there are multiple contradictions going on when it comes to free speech at the moment in our society, because it's never been easier to voice your opinions thanks to social media, and yet people have never felt less heard. We have more voices than ever before, but arguably less plurality, or certainly less exposure to other viewpoints, because of social media, people are very quickly, through algorithms, pushed into echo chambers. We have a culture in which people have increasingly strong opinions, but often about things that they know very little about. And those opinions are often driven by personal interest or an individual's sense of identity. And what that leads to in our society and our politics, I think, is a tyranny of the minority. It means that people have this constant expectation that politicians hearing their arguments will agree with them. And when politicians don't, it's considered to be a failure of some sort of system, or as is heard very commonly at the moment, a failure of the uni party. And I think that politicians really struggle, or have really struggled, to respond to this culture, fearing blame, fearing a negative headline. They reach for tactics that push responsibility away, which is why we have the endless costly inquiries and why we have arm's length bodies, and why we have politicians who often favour process over making actual decisions. And as a result, we find ourselves in this doom loop where we talk about the same issues time and again, same problems, the same dilemmas year after year, and nothing ever seems to progress, nothing ever seems to happen. And the public is frustrated, and politicians perhaps even more so, because I think any of them arrive in Parliament to realise that because so much has been outsourced to Anglos, they don't have the potency to deliver perhaps for their constituents in the way that they would like. And actually, I think it could get worse with a five-party system, because I think MPs will increasingly be thinking of putting the next general election. They'll be worried that they're going to lose their seats. We're seeing so much evidence of this already, and they will therefore seek short-term gains over long-term solutions. And just to give one illustration, I think that the WASPy saga is quite instructive, and I accept that some people in this room will disagree with me, but I don't believe that they deserve compensation payouts on the basis that the government can't reward those who fail to take responsibility for understanding changes to pension rules, and yet after much deliberation the government has capitulated on that. Now, I have a lot of sympathy for the position that politicians find themselves in. I'm a parent, and I know that it's harder to take something away than it is to refuse to give it in the first place. Losses loom larger than gains. But you know, short-termism in politics at the moment, it always seems to be sort of easier than being honest and taking the initial tough decision. So that's the politics. I'll just move on to some reflections on the state of journalism in the UK at the moment. I think that we have democratized information, which broadly speaking could be a positive in our society, but we've done it without strengthening judgment. Professional journalism was once a filter, but now it's one voice among millions. Anybody with a keyboard can anoint themselves as an expert on a particular subject and launch a conspiracy Substack to prove it. Now, I accept that you may think I have a professional interest in this matter, but I think in an era where the majority of people are getting their news from Twitter, we have to make sure that we equip young people with the tools that they need to separate fact from fiction, and we have to teach them to think critically. And a very important way that we do that is by giving them exposure to ideas that they may instinctively disagree with, rather than shield them from it. At the same time, I worry that trust is being eroded by a political and institutional class that isn't representative of the nation that it serves. So a 2025 survey found that the establishment, so politicians and civil servants and academics and judges, are drawn largely from the same metropolitan university educated slice of society. And that is adding perhaps to this sense that many citizens don't feel as though they are being heard. And that is why we've seen Brexit and the rise of Reform and the Greens and nationalist movements across the UK, because vast parts of the country just simply don't share the consensus that is held among the establishment. Just add quickly here that I do think that ethnic diversity is also shaping our political culture. We have many communities which come from traditions where loyalty is clan-based, where community leaders mediate politics, and where discussion happens within groups rather than between them. And we saw the risks of that in Northern Ireland, and it's not a model that we should repeat. And I think that politicians should be open and willing to discuss that element. So finally, how do we renew trust and restore plurality and strengthen freedom of expression that's not just loud but meaningful? I think that we must recommit to free speech. We have to do away with the idea that people have a right not to be offended if they don't. We need to scrap this idea of lived experience and this feeling that truth ought to be spawned to kindness. I think that we have to, through families and schools and communities, teach that disagreement isn't a threat, but in some ways it's actually our civic duty. We ought to be engaging in the battle of ideas, every single one of us. I think that we need more volunteering community events, and I worry that over-regulation is actually taking us in the opposite direction because of things like Martin's Law, which new legislation was being brought in with the best of intentions, you know, and because of health and safety, we are actually seeing the breakdown of civic life in this country. I mean, I read an example not so long ago about a group of volunteers who were banned from using a lawnmower on safety grounds, and so they can't continue to maintain a medieval cemetery. And this is just evidence, I think, of how difficult we seem to find it as a society to balance benefits and risk. And I do think that we need to restrict the power of quangos and hand it back to politicians, because I don't believe that anything has been more damaging to our democracy than the sense that the people who are elected are not the people who are accountable, and that politicians have handed over power, policy decisions that they ought to be making themselves, that they ought to believe in, and the public will hopefully trust them as a consequence of that, because at least they are able to hold it responsible.
Thank you. So Robert, from your time as Secretary of State for Justice, it would be really good to get your thoughts on the rule of law and how democratic debate can remain both vigorous but also be fair and safe for all.
Okay, I think first of all, the phrase "the rule of law," I think we need to be very careful about how we use it. It's not the law, it is a political construct. It's a very important political construct, but it's a political principle nonetheless. And actually, far from it being the diametric opposite of parliamentary sovereignty, the two actually go hand in hand. They're both sides of the same coin, in my view. And when you look at it like that, then some of the rather unfortunate and artificial and unhelpful debate that we seem to be having in certain parts of commentariat in the country at the moment about politics failing, therefore let's go to court, starts to fall away. You know, I've spent my life dealing with cases in courts, both as a private practitioner, then as a law officer, Solicitor General, and now back in practice as well. I can tell you, the court is not the place to resolve political disputes. Judges are not the people who should be given the power to resolve politics. They're not elected. And they are men and women, people just like us, with their own moral failings, their own moral foibles, their own imperfections, their own biases. But what they are very good at in this country is that they're trained to be fair and to apply justice independently. We're very lucky, despite some of the noise that we're hearing at the moment about juries, which I think is distinctly unfortunate, is directly relevant, by the way, to the debate we're having tonight. It is, I still think, a huge asset that we have in this country. Why is it an asset? Not only does it guarantee equality and the freedoms that we enjoy under the law, but it's also a really good selling point for this country in terms of international investment. If you're going to invest in a rule of law country, you want to know that your investment is going to be safe, and that if something goes wrong, you've got an address of grievance, and you've got an independent law system to enforce your grievance. So the rule of law is hugely important. What I find difficult is when it is either invoked by people of a different political viewpoint to try and question the legitimacy of an elected government, as we've seen. I certainly we saw it quite a lot during the Brexit years. A lot of people using that phrase, the government's breaking the law all the time, which frankly wasn't the case. Or the other extreme, where you've got populist politicians who think we can ignore the law, and that the solutions to intractable issues like illegal migration and mass movement of peoples, which are affecting the whole of the Western world, can be solved by us just ignoring our legal obligations, by walking away from international obligations, just by pretending somehow this country is exceptional, we can do what we like. I think that's nonsense. I think it's dangerous nonsense. I think that there are too many people out there, actually, not just from the extremes, but from mainstream parties that are fueling it as well. It's irresponsible, it's got to stop. What I do want to say in response to what we've heard already is that I don't think that changing the electoral system, I know Max and the Democrats obsessed with PR, will get us anywhere at all. I mean, countries with PR in the Western world are having exactly, guess what, the same democratic deficit issues that we are having. So that makes no difference at all. The real question, I think, for us to ask is whether representative democracy itself can survive in a world where people get used to pressing their keypad or pressing their phone and getting instant answers to the questions that they ask. That's the real issue. We're seeing now the fragmentation of conventional politics because I believe the power that we have in our pockets, social media power that exists out there. And this trend is only going to get faster and faster. The real question, I think, for politicians, I'm not an ex-politician anymore, each one get human rights, sort of. The real question for them is how on earth representative democracy is going to survive in an era where there just doesn't seem any room at the moment at all for either the sort of decisive action the politicians should be taking responsibility for, or those moments of reflection that very often politicians need in order to get decisions right. This 24/7 instant answer culture is a real pressure. The tyranny of the inbox. Max will have an inbox full of people telling him how awful he is or telling him how marvellous he is, according to the day of the week or the weather, according to the issue that might be voted upon that particular week, is a real problem, I think, for elected politicians. So what's the answer? Well, direct democracy? We all have keypads, we all vote on everything? Well, that can't be the case because, as has already been said, we've given people the means to discover information, but we've not actually given them the means to truly understand the power in their hands and how to verify the information that they get. I think the biggest single challenge that we have for all generations is this question of the lion's dividend. What is true anymore? What is truth? Is it an objective thing anymore? Is it my truth or is it your truth? That is a road that we're already embarked upon. And if we don't wake up quickly, then I'm not sure that we can come back. I strongly agree with what's been made about freedom of expression and freedom to offend. I strongly agree with exposing particularly the next generation to different ideas and that clash of ideas that is so important. But here's the thing, perhaps now left and right is redundant. Perhaps we are now in an age fully of identity politics. What's in it for me is the question I used to often get on the doorsteps, not what's for the good of the country. Now, call me old-fashioned, the politics I got involved with as a young man was all about actually what I thought was good for Britain, good for the country. That isn't moving the minds and hearts of millions of people. So we've got some pretty fundamental challenges. So these stats don't surprise me, they're not particularly new, but I can tell you this, that on the ground, it can be rebuilt, one house at a time, by the sort of granular local engagement that I know actually modern MPs are pretty good at, and the use of technology in order to reach out to people and give them the information they need about local issues in a way that is meaningful to them. So that they turn around and say, well, actually, my representatives are talking to me, they're communicating to me meaningfully, they're giving me the power to help influence a planning issue, a local amenity issue, giving me the power to actually have a say. That's going to require a huge amount of work by a political class that has got, I think, in some measure, used to, as you say, contracting out a lot of these things to other people. So I think responsibility isn't just about us, the electors, it's about them, the politicians as well, realising that they should be making decisions and not treating, to come back to the question of rule of law, as an excuse to allow the rule of lawyers and courts to be the place where our democracy is played out.
Ross, coming to you. from your work at the Mirror, what would you say the impact of people feeling overlooked in mainstream politics? How does it sort of play out, and how do you think it shapes their attitudes?
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. I write a column for the Mirror called Real Britain, which goes around the country, talking to people, talking to our readers in kind of underrepresented communities. We try to sort of speak on their issues and on their behalf. I've also done a lot of other different kind of journey type projects. Just finished working on a video series called Island of Strangers, where we've been off in various bits of the country trying to sort of listen to people and engage with. But I wanted to start by kind of rewinding a little bit to 2010, when I was covering the local elections in Barking Dagenham, which the BNP were expected to take control of the council. I'm sure people remember. And I remember knocking on this front door on a kind of quiet cul-de-sac, quite sort of typical Mirror readers cul-de-sac. Now, a woman peered out from behind the curtains, opened the window and shouted, "We're voting BNP." And when I asked why, she said that some nice men in smart suits had knocked on the door, and they said they'd empty the bins and sort out the dog shit. And this encounter set me on a kind of train of thought, which has followed me through quite a lot of my working life since. The dog shit in the bins had obviously become a kind of symbol for all of the things that had gone wrong in their lives. But there was also something else. She said that these men in their nice suits were the first people from any political party to knock on their door for over 20 years. And I think there were years of working class communities that were taken for granted by Labour, by mainstream parties, by Conservatives. And this was the start of that coming home to roost. If we fast forward 4 years to the spring of 2016 and the lead up to the Brexit referendum, again, my work always takes me to places like Stoke, Walsall, Southport, Burnley. We try to go something different every week to go and listen to people. And after a while, it occurred to me that it had been quite a few weeks since I'd spoken to anyone who said they intended to vote Remain. And the Mirror was backing Remain in that referendum, so I duly reported this to the people running Remain. And they said, not to worry, those people are not going to vote. And I don't know if I was more outraged at the time by the idea of those people or the wrongness of the assumption, and whether I was kind of secretly proud for them when they did vote, even though they didn't vote in the way that I would have preferred that they had voted. And then fast forward to May this year, and I was on the pier at Cleethorpes. I'll get all the glamorous assignments to cover Greater Lincolnshire's first ever mayoral election. And one by one, people on that pier were telling me how they couldn't wait to vote against net zero at the ballot box. As the wind turbines, which represent the kind of East Coast in high future prospects, were turning behind them in the background. And I think what all these electoral moments kind of have in common for me is that these weren't people who don't engage with democracy, but people who engage with democracy in anger. And I think at the moment, the most effective community organisers, in the absence of any great community organising going on at a political level, are not people, but emotions, things like anger, disillusionment, distrust. These are the sort of motivators. Because it's not just millions of people's perception that democracy is not working for them, it isn't working for them, our politics isn't working for them either. Since those council elections in 2010, things are much worse for most people at a council level in Barking, Dagenham and everywhere else. The bins are being collected even less around the country. They're not being collected at all if you live in Birmingham. And I think that George Osborne's kind of evil genius, if you like, was that his austerity cuts were devolved cuts that were handed down at a council level. So that at a local level, people have seen that whoever they voted for, from libraries, the issues they care about, libraries, adult social care, the waiting list for housing, paying for parking, everything's got worse and worse. Then they've been promised things with snazzy slogans like levelling up, which was more built up, squandered. And I think people are absolutely fed up. And actually, I think the government's Pride in Place strategy is one of the first attempts that I've seen to do some really good community work locally. It'll be interesting to see. The idea is it's led by communities. I think after levelling up, it's going to be pretty hard to persuade people to trust the government, that the government's actually got their kind of best intentions at heart. So for me, people's failed relationship with democracy seems to go hand in hand with everything that goes wrong in their lives, I think. I think the things that they do, park their car in the wrong place, be late to a DWP appointment, have disproportionate and even oppressive consequences every time they do anything. Whereas the things that politicians do don't seem to have the same level of consequence. The things that people's towns were once for have ended in a lot of parts of the country, and the things that they once thought would happen are no longer certain. The tech revolutions foisted an atomized world on all of us, but especially in those sorts of places. And there's even conflicting ideas about masculinity and other things that they might have taken for granted. They've been told they're left behind, like some sort of factory rejects. And I think when democracy seems to be failing and you're lost at sea, it's easy to see how authoritarianism in its different forms is a tempting answer. It's very confident, it's very simplistic, it often wears a smart suit, taps into people's anger. And I don't think that, by the way, we should be afraid to say that some of the anger that we've seen over the last 2 summers is racist. I've stood outside that hotel in Epping, I've covered a lot of the different protests, and people have actively expressed racist sentiments to me. So it's important to say that kind of first off. But I think it's also simultaneously true that in the absence of real power, picking up an England flag or a Welsh dragon or a Union Jack this summer became a way for some people to exercise some control over space that they feel that they've lost. And I realise that's quite a kind of negative take on this question, but I actually wanted to talk about something a bit more hopeful at the end, which was that this year when we started the new video project Island of Strangers, we tried to visit communities that we thought had something to teach us about overcoming divides. And spending time in places using that lens has given us a much more hopeful view, I think, of who we are as a country. These were people who are not just kind of rooted in place, but had a strong purpose. And there are people like that in pockets all over Britain. And we found a lot of hope in some quite unpromising places. We were working in a boxing gym in the shadow of the giant steel mill at Rotherham. Been working on the estate in Cardiff, which John Redwood once tarnished as a kind of symbol for feckless single mums. All over these places, we found people doing absolutely amazing things. They wouldn't necessarily think that they're connected to democracy or some kind of wider argument, but they're getting on with like great things. And really, those people should probably be here instead of me. But I think since the Southport riots and over the last couple of summers, we've allowed a very small minority of Britons to loudly define who we think we are as a nation. And the wrong lessons have been learned in some cases. The lessons of the mob, but not the people who cleaned up afterwards, who were the majority of the country. People might not feel represented by politicians or politics, but that doesn't mean that the people setting fire to police cars outside the asylum hotels represent them either. So to re-engage people with democracy, I think we need a democratic story that's worth telling, not just giving people back pride in place, but pride in purpose. Because purpose was the thread of connection that we kept finding in all these places that we went to. And I've come to the conclusion that purpose comes first. Talking to people about what they want to do and what they want to change is how we get permission to ask people to then engage in a democratic process. This summer, I was up in Hartlepool and spoke to a community leader called Sasha Bedding, who predicted the summer of 2025 riots. He wrote to Keir Starmer this summer, warning that he could see the same signs repeating again. He wrote to the Prime Minister, when people feel ignored, neglected, shut out, frustration builds and history shows us the terrible consequences. In order to fix the foundations of our democracy, we must act boldly and do things differently. When I asked him how we should do this, he said, the government needs to start addressing the growing sense of powerlessness in our communities by giving local people more control over their places and their lives. And I think he could have added, so they don't need to get the far right to empty their bins.
Thank you. So I've got a couple of questions, and then we're going to open up to the floor. Like hearing that Carnegie research, it's like incredibly depressing. Just how low people's sense of democratic well-being is, and how little sense of power and accountability they have. But I just want to kind of ask questions. So, what is at risk here? So, if people don't feel heard and have no confidence that government's accountable to them, what's the worst that can happen? What's the risk? Annabelle, can I come to you?
Yes, sure. Well, I mean, I don't know if it's the worst that can happen, but there's always dangers with crystal ball gazing. But I can tell you what I think will happen, and that's what's happening already, which is that people feel total sense of disillusionment with the main political parties and now being pushed into the arms of, you know, those with no record to defend, seemingly policies which range from the undeliverable to the insane, and the situation where we have incredible political instability. And it's going to be a very turbulent few years, just like it was at the start of the 20th century, 1920s and beyond, where we have succession of elections where the outcome is very difficult to predict. And I think that 2029, if Labour are able to cling on until then, will be the first example of that. We're going to have a huge amount of tactical voting where the level of information that people have isn't sufficiently granular that they're making informed decisions. And it's going to throw up all sorts of extraordinary responses. But, you know, perhaps you could argue that if you end up with Robert Cromwell is here, but a conservative reform coalition, perhaps that people will feel as though their voice is being heard. And equally, if you end up with a coalition of Lib, and possibly the Greens, then at least a cohort of covering even tighter. That, you know, people will to some degree feel as though their voices are indeed being heard. But at the moment, I don't really see that any effort is being made to combat the misinformation that's being pushed into public domain. I do feel that things are getting worse, and I wish that the BBC would restore neutrality and impartiality, because much as I'm not a believer in the licence fee, I do think that the BBC as a state broadcaster, which is presenting people purely with facts, has a very important role to play.
It's not a state broadcaster, though, is it?
The BBC?
The BBC is not the state broadcaster.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not like
Public sector broadcaster.
it's public service broadcaster funded by the licence fee. It's not a state broadcaster. Russia Today or whatever, or that woman on North Korean TV just saying what Kim Jong Un says.
You would say.
What was the question? Sorry, I did say the point because the BBC is often, as a Liberal Democrat, I don't have a huge amount of time for some of the things the BBC does. It puts Nigel Farage on too much stuff. We fought a campaign to stop the BBC putting Nigel Farage on everything and to try to balance it up a bit. And
We find too much stuff.
the BBC,
One's calling it 30%. It's by far and away the most popular political party. At the
well,
moment.
over the summer, you would have thought it was on much higher. But the BBC, so the BBC is something that actually needs to be defended. It does need to be balanced up. I agree with you, but possibly not in the same way that you think, Annabelle. So the question was all about
Risk.
well, the risk is, I think there is a huge risk here that at the next election we end up with a government that is elected on an even lower proportion of the vote than the last election, and that ends up with all kinds of democratic chaos. And I suspect that people will feel like their voice is even less heard. The points that would be made about devolution, I think, are really important, actually. And as a Liberal Democrat, I'm pleased to hear people saying empowering local communities is part of the solution, because I think it's the number one thing that we can do to make sure that people do feel like their voices are being heard. If your local council had enough money to pick up the bins properly and clear up the dog shit, and to make sure that the planning system worked, to make sure that the licensing system worked, to go and investigate the restaurants that had 0 hygiene scores and shut them down properly, I think people would have more of a sense of faith in the system. If the potholes were filled, for example, you know, I'm tempted to reflect that the one way that citizens are really good at making their voices heard is when someone suggests that something balmy happens in their local area. They are really, really good, actually, at then stopping that happening. What they're not quite so good at, because the local council doesn't have enough money to do it, is making sure that the right things get delivered in the right places, that you've got enough school places, that you've got enough GP places, for example. And that is where people feel like democracy is really letting them down. And to the points that have been made, actually, by Annabelle and Robert at the start, about the sort of outsourcing of political power to others, it is really important. If I want to get a new GP surgery opened up in my constituency, I talk to the NHS Integrated Care Board. Well, good luck chatting to the ICB as a politician. Can you get them to build something? No, probably not. what do you ask? You say, how do you get one built? They say, oh, well, there's 4 or 5 different ways in which a GP surgery might be provided in your constituency, Mr. Wilkinson. And I say, well, what's the best route? And they say, oh, well, it's very complicated and you've got to spend a long period of time campaigning and going through it. And politicians just don't have that direct power, and it has been outsourced to quangos, and that is actually a real problem, and it should be acknowledged as a problem, whether you're on the left, right, or centre of politics. And if those local level things outside people's front doors don't get done, then they will be forced to vote for people who I would find unpalatable, whether it's the BNP or whether it's Nigel Farage or whether it's others. And it's the old Tip O'Neill quote, isn't it? It's all politics is local ultimately, and that's why I had in my opening remarks the thing about devolution of local government reorganisation, because if that is got right and people do feel like their local areas are working a bit better, I think that will take some of the sting out of the problems that we're currently seeing in public debate.
Thank you. So can I ask then, how can government be more accountable to the people and not just to those people with the loudest voices? Robert.
Well, look, I just want to go back to this point about the tyranny of the minority. I do think that we are in a position at the moment where we've got a political class that is just frightened of everything. It's totally dominated by the week's trends in its inbox, as opposed to having the confidence to look at the bigger picture. But one of the advantages of this, first past the post system is that we actually do have quite a stable majority down the road, and they've been elected for a 4 or 5 year period, and they've got a big majority. Now, why the hell are they just getting on with making the decisions they can make with the cover of that majority that in the medium to long term will do the country good? I think what politicians are forgetting down there, particularly those of them, Max has been around the local government a long time, I'm not going to say they're novice, but a lot of them new to politics think that it's the politics of December 2025 that's going to determine the election in 2028, 29. It's not. It's not. It's going to be a totally different scenario there. I just wish some of my former colleagues had the backbone and the guts to just make a decision. I found in when I had my time in office and senior office, high office in this country, the worst thing you could do, unless you didn't have nearly enough information, was to put off the evil day and not make a decision. Make the decision. It might not be a perfect decision. It might be flawed. You might look back and think, if I'd known X, Y, and Z, I'd have done it differently. But making decisions is a really important part of the process. Why? Because it allows then things to start flowing. And then, we can then judge the consequence of the decisions made fairly at an election. One of my predecessors, Lord Hailsham, famously wrote about the elective dictatorship. This concept that once every 4 or 5 years, people of this country have a vote and then we're ignored. There was a lot of force in what he said. And I think that we are now in this sort of contradictory world where we're hearing a lot of, I think, good things about mayoralties, can't quite say that word, and the devolution of power, particularly economic development power, which I really think local government has been stripped out. The capacity of local government to do economic development has collapsed. I think that's a good thing. But then at the same time, we've still got this relentless move, not just to regulation, but to the power of regulators, not just to enforce and carry out settled democratic policy, but to make policy. That's where I start to depart from the model of regulation that I think was originally envisaged back in the 80s, at the beginning of all of this, where organisations like Ofwat, at the beginning, actually was quite effective. Its first Director General actually held the companies to account and made them invest more in capital investment in our water system. And then it evolved into a mission creep, which has ended up with the reforms that are now coming quite rightly as a result of the government's review, the review done by John Cunliffe, which I think has been a very good precedent for what we need to do in the rest of the regulatory state. So, this is prosaic, granular stuff, but in my view, the government with a big majority has an opportunity to do something really quite sensible and radical to the regulatory state, and to bring back decisions in-house, not necessarily the pork barrel stuff with respect that Max was talking about. I don't think we want politicians deciding pork barrels. What we do need is the power of politicians to be able to, at the very least, have a say and a direct influence in decision making about where local resources are to be deployed, but and then at the same time to be accountable directly for where there has been a failure to do that. You know, fundamentally, if we can get back to that sort of clarity and those clear lines, I think we'll be in a much better situation. There's too much hand wringing in politics now. Too much, you know. It's not my responsibility. It's not my fault. It's not my problem. And I think that is what is turning so many people off. So, you know, I certainly would get to grips with regulation and the function and form of our regulators as a priority.
Ross, can I ask you for your thoughts?
Yes, just in terms of your first question about what's at stake, I think I covered a bit of the US election. I was in Philadelphia just before the US election. I think that's at stake. Like that was one of the level of kind of disinformation and sort of tribalism that was going on in Philadelphia around that time was pretty extraordinary. And I think we'll be looking at kind of Donald Trump style presidency, well, Prime Minister here, and also we only need to look across the road to Italy and other countries that are sort of struggling with these issues as well. In terms of how we make politicians more accountable, it's community power to me. It's just how do we at every level put power back into the hands of communities to make decisions, to be connected to things. I think it's a bit like that sort of prescription where people are kind of depressed, are told to go and stand outside in bare feet and kind of get reconnected to themselves and the planet. But politics needs to kind of go out and reroute itself very, very deeply in communities. And again, I do feel that something from the last 14 years, austerity has just stripped away a lot of those connections, and we have to remake them and just give people more control, more just allow people to be seen more as grown-ups about how they spend their money. And I think there's some really interesting work. The Cooperative Party doing some really interesting stuff around this on community power. Labour's got the Pride in Play stuff that I mentioned earlier, but it needs to be much bigger than that. And I do think that devolution, just any way to kind of devolve power and involve people. And I know Annabelle wasn't happy about the people with lived experience, but to me, there couldn't be enough people with lived experience engaged in politics at the level at which I think it's about how do we involve people at every layer of society in deciding the politics that we have, instead of just having you say people.
We just let them experience.
Let us finish.
Let people bring in their experience, because there's this concept of lived experience which feeds into my truth versus your truth versus the objective truth.
Yeah, I suppose it depends how you see lived experience.
What experience isn't lived anyway?
I couldn't this thing about people really aching to want to become mini councillors and take the reins of power. I don't think they do it at all. I think they expect their elected representatives to actually do the job properly and be able to come up with answers to them and communicate with them. I think the problem is if we keep on saying these worthy things about giving communities power and citizens' assemblies and all this stuff, what was the point of representative democracy, folks? What's the point? Why bother to vote? Why have these paid people to represent us, to whom we give the power to make decisions? Because we're too bloody busy to worry about every single issue in our community. We're just too preoccupied. I'm not sure about all of this. I spent 40 years of my life on doorsteps, and I'm still. Can you believe it's still going out? I was out last weekend helping
For the
civil
Tories.
rights campaign. Of course, I'm a Tory. Always will be. People say to me, for God's sake, when are you lot going to actually do the job you're paid to do properly? And I think that's really interesting. People are happy to delegate, but they want to know that there's faith in the system that they're giving responsibility to. And they do expect, look, I do agree, it's got to be a two-way street. You can't just disappear for 5 years and not talk to them. But I'm not sure that people are aching to suddenly turn up in a community hall on Tuesday night and talk about assisted dying. I just don't think that.
That's all.
Don't think that's what
With
Ross
that's
said.
that's not what I'm arguing for. I'm talking about where
Well,
there are communities who are very, very knowledgeable, where there's brilliant community leaders across different estates who know what's the best thing for
So-
their estate,
I'm
regeneration,
with you there.
transport, all of those sorts of. I'm
I'm
not
with
saying
you
that they need to make a decision
I'm,
on assisted dying.
I'm absolutely with you there. I think
And I think a citizens' assembly on immigration would be absolutely brilliant. I think the whole country could have a big citizens' assembly on immigration and discuss it. And we could have a sensible. If you look at Northern Ireland managed to do it on abortion, why couldn't we do it on? Ireland managed to do it on abortion.
I spent a lot of time as chairman of the Ireland Select Committee. I think that where you have the granular issues that really affect an estate or a community, absolutely, that's where they're the experts. You know, certainly as a local MP covering really varied socio-demographic profile in Swindon. London Overspill Estate with one of the lowest socio-economic demographics of the southwest. I one of my central ward was the most diverse ward in the southwest. Yeah, I saw it all, and I tell you what, that sort of level of granular expertise was there. But you know, at the end of it all, it is still about good old-fashioned leadership. And if you're electing politicians to represent you, they've got to take responsibility. This is point by point my first presentation. They've got to take responsibility to get granular and get down there, and as you say, involve the experts who know about their community. So I'm all for that. What I'm skeptical about is this sort of high-minded. Well, I'm not saying we're guilty of this one, but there is a lot of this high-minded view that some people are just aching to spend all their waking hours, trying to make decisions that they're paying representatives to do. Just saying.
So for anyone that knows me, I've got incredibly strong opinions on participatory deliberative. Chair, I won't.
Roberts.
Fully so, but I won't go into it now because it's really.
You should abuse your position as the chair.
That would be very abusive of my position. I won't do that. I will open it to the floor though to see if anyone has any questions for our panel. I would ask you when you have a question to please introduce yourself and keep your question as brief as possible and try not to monologue. Thank you. Take it back.
Hi, Yaz Alter here from Involve. We also work on participation and have a passionate view that citizens should be involved and how it should be used. I just thought it was striking that at times the conversation seemed to veer away from the topic rather than focusing on the voice of people. There were discussions around missing disinformation, whether or not lived experience is a thing that we should care about, tribalism, and the ways that people's cultures impact how they vote. These are, I think, really endemic of points of view where people resist actually going out and speaking to people and hearing their perspectives, and maybe a fear of that to some extent. And that was definitely something that I think certainly the previous government exemplified. What I do want to offer is a helpful definition of experience and lived experience for those who might be interested. Experience is just stuff that happens casually. Lived experience is the ways in which systems, structures, laws, policies affect the way in which you actually live. They might make you feel humiliated. They might prevent you from accessing essential services. And I think that's a really important distinction to understand from people who care about mis and disinformation, accuracy, and the ways in which the electorate is actually impacted by their actions. Thank you.
Was there a question in that?
What would be a great way for people to make their voices heard? It sounds like voting sucks. It sounds like people's lived experiences and it. It sounds like people's survey results are not worthwhile listening to. What would be a way that you guys think would actually be good to make your voices heard in democracy?
Thank you. There was a gentleman here. I'll take three at the first go. This gentleman, and sorry, was there a hand at the back there, sir? Okay, great. Please.
I'm gonna bring it back to the research because that's what I'm really interested in. What we're all reading over here on pairs. This is some really interesting research.
Sorry, who are you?
I'm sorry, I'm Jason. I'm a postdoc at Goldsmiths, studying AI-generated misinformation and susceptibility to chatbot parasocial relationships. Jason Hotel, that's my name. All right, back to the research. I really like it. I'm really interested in it. There's some fascinating trends that kind of make out clear, intuitive correlations. As you get older, there was, a higher well-being scores among older generations. You can make similar observations with how much money they have, how much kids they have, etc. There were some interesting outliers that I just had a question about that I hope you could explain a little bit more. Very few outliers, but one that I found really interesting. Obviously, democratic well-being is the lowest score among any demographic compared to the other forms of well-being. They feel least confident in democratic well-being. What I found really interesting is it's the only category in your age demographics where you actually see very slightly, not statistically significant per se, that people 35 to 54 feel less secure about democracy than people younger than them. Whereas in every other category, people in that age bracket feel more secure than the younger generation coming in. So I'm just wondering, I mean, I obviously the numbers are very abstract. I'm not looking for like personal anecdotal tales, but just like if you had any comment on why that would be that the people who are maybe more older millennial Gen X would have less confidence in politics than maybe Gen A Zoomers slightly. I found that really interesting.
Thank you. And gentleman at the back.
Thank you, Peter Hurst. I was just wondering what the panel thought about more and better political education in our schools, whether it should be part of the curriculum and people should be examined on their political knowledge as they go through our educational system. Thank you.
Okay, so what's the best way of people getting their voices heard? Susan, I'll probably come to you specifically on the research, and then should we have more and better political education in schools? Do you want to kick us off with the research question?
Yeah, well done for reading the data tables there at the back of the report.
Fascinating.
To be honest, off the top of my head, I don't know. I suspect that the reason for that is, and in a way, it's good that everything's not linear, because if everything was much better amongst the higher age groups and worse amongst the lower age groups, then we would be really looking at lacking hope overall. I suspect on things like democratic well-being, it's because people in that age group got slightly more experience of some of the things we're talking about than the lower age groups, because it does include things like banks, for example. It's not just some of the legal system, and I guess by the time you get to 35, you've perhaps had more experience of dealing with banks and the legal system and the other aspects that go into making up that score. You've probably also been around more elections and remember more that's happened in the past. So yeah, I suspect off the top of my head that probably got something to do with it.
Interesting, a concave. So then after a certain bracket, you become this, I guess you feel good about it again, because then if you're above 55, you suddenly have a higher confidence and
You don't care much.
Yeah.
yeah, you don't care much.
Yes, do.
It's just very, it's the only one I could see a concave in, like a of it kind of dipping and then
Yeah.
coming back. And so I just thought that was,
No, it's an interesting question. I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. I'm also happy to give you the data set if you want to
yeah.
publicly about and delve into it in more detail. I suspect it's something along those lines, that it's got something to do with the experience in terms of types of things that go into it and the likelihood of having experienced them. For someone that's not far off that top age bracket, though, believe you me, it's not that you just get bored of these things, but your perspectives do change a little bit later in life. Anyway, that's my views on that.
Thank you. Max, did you want to come in?
I was going to say, if you read the political parties' manifestos at the elections, most of them are geared towards the over 55s. So for valid reasons, because that's the high turnout age groups, right? Everyone who's knocked on doors, me and Robert will have the experience. You're more likely to find a highly engaged voter over the age of 55 than one who is under 30. So it's not surprising that they perhaps feel a little bit better served by the political system than the terrible millennials like me. I think there is a point about better political education here. I'm somewhat sceptical as a liberal about the government getting involved in political education in a way that wouldn't end up telling people that they should believe the things that the teacher believes, and that's a real difficulty, I think. However, now we've decided to give 16-year-olds the vote, and I'm probably the only Liberal Democrat who is entirely ambivalent about that, and I don't think it's going to make any difference to the next election result. Now that we've done that, I think the government has a responsibility to do something to make children better informed, because the kids who are 12 today are likely to be able to vote in 2029, which is a really interesting thought. Although I have to say, some of the most challenging questions I get when I go to local events are the ones from primary school children, and they sometimes get to the nub of things in a way that community groups don't always, in a really direct and affronting way. What works to get people engaged? Yaz's question from the back there. I think that the answer probably is anything that riles them up and gets them really angry, because the one thing I know that I will get communication about is the whole, the subject of a road closure. I would have probably been elected to Parliament 5 years earlier if Cheltenham Borough Council and the local county council had not combined to close a road, which was blamed largely on me. And my predecessor was a brilliant guy and a nice bloke, actually, Alex Chalk. And he campaigned really well and rode the tide of anger against the local councils and blamed the Liberal Democrats, and I lost by 981 votes. And so things that get
campaign for
certainly will. We've heard your monologues today, and that would have convinced many voters, I'm sure. So on the point about getting people engaged, I will just go back to my point about the GP surgery. And I was not campaigning for pork barrel politics. I was merely talking about the problem where, if you want to, as a politician, try to work out what is the way to get services delivered in your constituency, the sort of Byzantine systems that have been put in place make it really difficult, and local residents feel that too, right? So where you've got multiple different authorities that you might get in touch with, if you get in touch with the first three and they all basically shrug their shoulders, it's no wonder that people end up being frustrated and thinking, well, I've got to vote for something on the extreme left or the extreme right to try to cut through this stuff. And I do think that although clearly you can look at me, right? I'm not a massive hippie here, but I do think that community engagement is a really important thing that we ought to be all doing, and that can solve the political problem if we do it properly, and if we properly empower local authority and regional authority to make decisions that impact people's lives. I'm actually probably the only Liberal Democrat who's a bit sceptical about citizen assemblies. I don't think they're the worst thing in the world, but I don't think they're going to solve all the problems. And I will put that, because when I speak to people who are really in favour of them, then they say, if we had a climate emergency assembly, everyone would immediately be very informed. Well, what happens when you have the climate assembly and then there's a load of people, the 20% or whatever, who now really think that net zero is the wrong thing? Their voice must be represented in that climate assembly, and they're very unlikely to change their view on climate change and net zero as a result of a citizens' assembly. And what happens to the climate assembly result when you have to reflect those people's views? You don't get the result that perhaps people like Zach Polanski and the Green Party and those in the climate movement, like me, would like that assembly to give us. And that's a real
climate assembly. It's really effective.
Oh, and
people did
change. It was
quite a lot of
yeah,
things.
it was
Right, okay, yeah.
it was effective, but again, I'm not quite sure it has done the trick.
It's not a substitute for elected
It is not
politics.
I think that's right. Yeah.
There's also something about the fact that
Well, you see, this is the problem. People are saying the political system's failing. So I've heard it so many times, with fellow lawyers. Oh, we should go to law. We should use the courts as a way to get our point across. No, disaster. If you strip away, that link between the vote and what you can change, then why do we bother with democracy? I'm sorry, I'm a fundamentalist on this. I'm all for as many voices as possible, enriching the debate and being heard. And as politicians, MPs have a responsibility to be respectful, humble, and to listen. I mean, listening is the most undervalued quality of a politician. They're very good at broadcasting, not so good at listening. But to suggest that somehow by doing this that we're going to be able to fulfil the wishes of everybody is again to ignore the fact that politics is about hard choices, and there are going to be times when people are not going to be happy with the decision you've made, and the answer for them is to go and vote for somebody else. And that is what I used to say to many people, and of course in the end it did in overwhelming numbers, but that's another story. And you know what, that's democracy. Nobody was killed, and the great thing about this country is that we had a peaceful transfer of power within hours, which is in many parts of the world just not possible. The answer to the point about education, yes, but it's got to be done sensibly. I don't like the phrase political education. It does have this sort of I'm thinking of Maoist China in the 50s. I think far better to have civic education, which is actually part of the syllabus, developing that. And here's the thing: should we have a little bit of legal education as well? It'd be nice, wouldn't it, to teach people their responsibilities? The fact that I've done a lot of public legal education in schools. I can tell you, young people are really interested to know who owns the apps and the property on their mobile phones, what their rights are in terms of the sharing and use of information, and how to be safe. Now, all those things, I think, are part of how to educate people to be citizens. And I think that the politics side of it, what representative democracy is, what your council does, all of that should be part of it so that young people feel more empowered.
I was just going to say that as a parent of 2 kids who are doing a citizenship GCSE at the moment, which is
Yeah.
compulsory at their school,
Yeah.
they are learning all that stuff. I mean, that I was trying to help with revision only recently, and as somebody who's fairly politics adjacent, I actually didn't know the answer to quite a few of the questions that they were answering. And that was, me running out of remembering my exact county council kind of law from journalism training or whatever. But I'm just saying it's pretty detailed, and there's loads of stuff about law, and lots of kids, it is compulsory in a lot of schools at the moment, and they do talk a lot about politics. My daughter will also be in that group who'll be able to vote at 16. I think they're really politically engaged. At her school, she's at a very, I think, I can't remember who made up the word bog standard state school. I think it was something that. I think it was Balls. They're at a bog standard state school, but they're very engaged with politics. And I also think that generation are going to just be very different in how they approach politics in the future, and they're going to expect, because they live in a different way where things are very responsive, they're going to expect a different democracy as they grow up. I was really lucky yesterday to be at an event for Dan Malone Taylor's trust. I worked on that story a long time over the last 25 years. Yesterday they had a big event in Peckham with a whole load of young people from a very deprived estate near where Dammy, very literally yards from where Dan Malone was killed 25 years ago. And all these young people sat there, and people said to them, what should we do about knife crime? What should we do about, youth violence, all that stuff? And the conclusion of those young people in the room, who are mostly between sort of 14 to 18, was they all said, just stop talking about knife crime, stop talking about youth violence. We're just kids that are affected by violence. Why can't we talk about poverty? Why can't we talk about inequality? Why can't we talk about the housing estate is dilapidated and it needs repairs? Why do we have to live like animals? Basically, was kind of what these kids were saying. And you just thought it was such a refreshing perspective. And I thought, I can't wait till those kids are involved in politics, because things might actually change.
Thank you. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. We've gone over a little bit, but I think it's an interesting debate. Yeah, 2 gentlemen front.
Thanks for all your input. I just wanted to engage some sort of utopian thinking, because it's all quite depressing. If we imagine the ultimate elected politicians in this utopian world, what would you say are the qualities and characteristics of the electorate that elect those politicians?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Andy, founder of a company called Citizenry. We do public policy and training consultancy for the public sector. I've been doing a huge amount of community work in Lambeth since being freelance, and a thing I'd like to reflect, partly to try and end on a positive tone, as you've just sought to do, is, while at the national level everything feels a bit depressing, and at the individual level we've heard that things are atomised, people are feeling separate, people are feeling isolated. At the community level, in community groups, it feels hugely energized. In Lambeth, there's thousands of community groups taking action across all kinds of areas, and it's really struck me that the energy in those groups isn't really reflected in the rest of society. And actually, if you spend time in one of those groups, you feel like almost anything is possible. So to me, a question is how we harness and advocate for that, how we support that. Local government's really not funded very well, and they're kind of an interesting organisation to have to deal with. But that's my question to the group, is how we advocate for and emphasise and draw out that energy and get that more widely.
Who'd like to come in on those questions? So what are the qualities of the electorate that would elect that perfect utopian politician? And secondly, how do you actually harness the energy of communities?
Yes, sure. I'll just talk about the electorate. I mean, as I said in my remarks, I think that we've become very me, and that is a consequence in large part of the fact that people don't feel as though their living standards are improving. And that will trace us back to the global financial crisis and the fact that ultimately they haven't been, and real wages have stagnated, and people have found it more and more difficult to access public services, and they simply don't believe that the sunlit uplands lie ahead. And I think that that has led to a society that's quite dog eat dog, where everybody is out for themselves, trying to draw as much as they can increasingly from the state, which is why over half of the British public are now net recipients from the government. So I think if we actually had a government that was able to deliver growth, then a lot of these problems would be less. But ultimately, you want an electorate that is putting to the country first before their individual needs. But that would be a lot easier to do if we had economic growth in the sense that we were becoming a more prosperous nation. And I'll just say one thing on political education. I think it's a very nice idea in principle. My worry is that you read about things like Kent schools teaching year 10 pupils that reforms policies on immigration are akin to fascism. You have schools where they are not giving children a balanced view, in my view at least, on issues like climate change. I think it's an absolutely vital challenge that we've all got to come together and tackle. But I don't like the fact that we are making so many young people feel anxious about it, and all of these sorts of things stem from the fact that the teachers are overwhelmingly left-leaning, and I don't know how you get balance. Maybe it isn't even something that you necessarily need. Maybe it's just about implementing the right curriculum for young people, so that, as I say, you may all disagree with those ideas, but why not have them out there so that young people can learn how to challenge them rather than just shut them down?
I am reluctant to talk about the qualities of the electorate. They will assess themselves. On community groups and energy, I think it's really interesting, isn't it, that as local government, which has typically been the organisation that has been in touch with community groups, has become smaller and less able to deliver stuff. It has basically said, well, we're putting aside the community pride pot this year for however many hundreds of thousands of pounds, devolving it to a community group, which then delivers a load of stuff in a really low faff, efficient way. And they decide what's best for the local community. And I think that is much, much better than the traditional way of doing it. And in fact, it is now the only way that local government is able to deliver quite a lot of its services. And particularly in my area, there is a lot of work with third sector partners, and it's largely very successful. And I think a lot of the energy is there, because if you talk to your local government officers, they're beholden to some quite complex frameworks, and it's really difficult for them to get things done. If you go to John and Mavis, who run the local community group or run the local community hall, they're able to cut through that bureaucracy really, really quickly, because it doesn't exist for them, and they are really good at it. And they're the people who know the people who live around that community hall, and they know what those people are going to want. And that's why there's so much energy in community groups. And actually, that's what I see across my constituency as well. In the past, I think there would have been a lot more council officers floating around and helping with all that sort of stuff. Now you've got one community engagement officer in my local council who is a manager, and then there's a couple of members of staff who are underneath him. We've got about 5 different jobs, and they really help a lot of the community grassroots stuff that goes on. And that is a really good way of empowering communities, and you're obviously feeling it where you are. I feel that a lot. My constituency, a lot of the stuff that happens that's really positive, nearly all of it, in fact, is not by the local council or anything to do with the government. It's local communities doing stuff themselves, and the council sometimes getting out of the way, and the state getting out of the way is, I think, part of the lessons that we probably need to learn in 2025 about how things can actually happen. The state should empower, and it should break down barriers to allow communities to do stuff, and part of that is just saying, here's the power, over to you. Back to devolution again.
Thank you. If you can do it in 1 minute, do you want to answer the question about kind of how do we get to this utopian politician and
Utopia is really overrated, So we're all human, we're all deeply flawed and imperfect. What I think the great myth about politics is that we elect politicians and we expect them to be perfect. are never going to be perfect. They're going to reflect the society that we exist. I mean, you know, the perfect democracy was the demos, wasn't it? It was the small Athenian ideal where there were a few hundred people all equally well informed who could make informed decisions. It's not the world in which we live, and we'll never live in that world. Therefore, it is, I think, the responsibility of those who get elected in this flawed system to be honest with people and to stop trying to please everybody all the time. Stop obsessing about what's in your inbox on, you know, December the 8th, 2025, and actually try and do the bigger picture stuff. And by the way, if you're elected to the House of Commons, you're a legislator. So legislate. Stop trying to be a glorified social worker. You know, there's a real issue here about, I think, what we're asking MPs to do now. And you know, look, my inbox was immense. My casework was immense. I mean, you're trying to do about 4 different jobs in one. And also the fact that we pay them a ridiculously low amount of money as well means that we get the politicians we deserve, frankly. You know, we really
It's not low rate of fuel, you really do. If you're
No.
a firefighter
no, I'm sorry.
or
I'm sorry.
normal
I'm sorry.
community.
I'm sorry. No, that's nonsense. You need to actually pay legislators properly. This is a serious job. The fact that we pay the Prime Minister of this country is lower than a Chief Executive of a middling local authority is just laughable. It is absurd. Let's be honest about it and actually pay them the going rate. We might get better people getting involved in politics as well, because I can tell you what, you don't do it for the money unless you're corrupt, and you know, I'm afraid one or two of them who are, and there's no doubt about that.
The last
But
government
let's
engaged
have-
on the ground.
I was going to say.
I thought we were having an adult conversation. But you know, I think the time for piety is about all of this. It's just over. Let's be honest about what the job we want our MPs to do. I want them to scrutinise legislation. I want them to actually, you know, do a proper job of passing decent laws, because God knows we need that. And one of the problems is that the plethora of laws that either have an anti policy basis or are not well drafted is making things worse, not better. I really think that, you know, one of the things we've got to educate above all is our legislators to actually do the job better. And perhaps we will see clearer and more understandable law that all of us can access. You know, as a lawyer, I do not believe law should just be for the lawyers. I want law to be for everybody, and I want it to be understandable and easily accessible. That's one of the problems I think that we've got in this country, is that you know, we make things so complicated that ordinary people can be forgiven if they just don't know where to start. And I do think it does begin with actually getting the legislators that we need and deserve.
Last word.
I was just going to say that I think the quality in the electorate that you would want to change would be cynicism. And in terms of challenging cynicism, that is also about PPE, all sorts of things like that, and the politics that you see around you. And it's probably best done at a local level, building upwards, like everything else. And I just wanted to say to the questioner from Lambeth, I think that's probably what I was trying to say at the beginning, but you said it better than me, which is, I think there are, on a hopeful note, I think there are millions and millions and millions of people across this country who work every day trying to make their world a better world. They do it for zero pay, nothing like what an MP might earn. And they roll up their sleeves and they get the most amazing stuff done. And the question for me is, how do we get more money and support to those people and let them run their own lives and make things better for the people around them?
And with that, I think we're going to draw this evening to a close. I've got a few thank yous. Firstly, to all of you for being here, for asking your really great and really difficult questions. That's been really, really good. And thank you for everybody joining online as well. Thank you, obviously, to our funders of the network, Carnegie UK and Emphasis on Urban Health. And lastly, to the panel, to Susan, to Ros, to Robert, to Annabelle, and to Max. You've shown us that we can just about disagree. Actually, very much for that. Yeah. So a big round of applause.